Let me introduce this session, which is the first of the day, called Sustainable Food Policies and Markets in an Unsustainable World. It's a very long title and a bit of a mouthful. Before we start and I introduce the speakers, let me first introduce myself. I'm Frédéric Simon. I'm the editor of Euractiv.com. We're a specialized media in EU policies. We have a section on agriculture where you can read articles about the future of the CAP and things like that. We have journalists today covering this session, and you will be able to follow up on our site with a number of interviews and coverage. Before we get started, let me first introduce the speakers. We'll have first an introduction from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, who is represented today by Alexander Saris, sitting next to me. We have next the ambassador of Malawi to the EU, and I would probably make a big mistake if I was to spell your name, so I would even refrain from that. And then giving a Russian perspective on things, we have Mr. Dmitry Rilko from the Institute of Agricultural Market Studies in Russia. Mr. Saris will make the introductory statement in a few minutes. Let me maybe set the scene for this session. Sustainable food policies in an unsustainable world. Obviously, we've heard in the session before about the challenges of climate change and that the consequences that this has already on agriculture around the world. Now, Europe is not the most hardest hit, but Russia and Malawi may have different experiences to share with us. We also heard in the previous session about some fundamental strains which are being put on agricultural systems worldwide, and Mr. Saris will explain in more detail what these are, the population growth in particular, and the consequent rising demand for food. Also, as a background, obviously a lot of you may remember the 2008 food price crisis, which has led to some rioting in some parts of the world. And more recently, even in Europe, we had some very shaky markets for the milk, which led to a number of political interventions in Europe as well. So we do have indeed a context nowadays where markets are coming under strain for a variety of reasons, and we'll try to elucidate a number of them during that session. Let me also add that we'll try and keep the presentations very short, because we're trying to open the session to questions from the floor, and we have to keep to our timing very strictly, because the next session starts at 11:30 sharp. So without further ado, Mr. Saris.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to supplement some of the initial general comments that were given this morning, and I prepared some slides just to illustrate what I'm going to say. The first thing is, everybody talked about demand this morning. I would like to talk a little bit about production. And the question raised is how much agricultural output needs to be increased by 2050 in the next 40 years. As you can see in the graph, the growth in the next 40 years of food production in order to be able to feed the world of 9 billion that people were talking about will be about 70%, while it has been about 148% in the previous 40 years. So obviously, there will be a need for an increase in production, but less so than in the past. More importantly, most of that increase will have to come from developing countries, as you can see in that graph below. The developing countries will be called to produce about 250% increase in their net food production. Now, interesting thing is, where will all that agricultural growth come from? In terms of area expansion, there is a lot of area still around the world that has production potential, but that doesn't mean, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the great repositories still of potential land. But of course there is concerns about biodiversity loss, carbon emissions, erosion, and about economic feasibility are the ones that are going to determine whether land expansion is going to be one of the major issues in land expansion. On climate change, of course, that will affect land suitability and yields, but very unevenly. Initially, there will be adverse yield effects on sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, but positive elsewhere, but eventually will be adverse everywhere. Now, yield increases have accounted for the majority of growth in agricultural production in the past, and will continue to be so in the future. Half of that from improved seeds and about half from increased inputs, especially water and fertilizer. That's where the prospects are for the future. Now, in terms of the medium term, about the next 15 or so years, and this is what politicians mostly care about because the 40 years is perhaps too much of a long term. When you look at agricultural production and trade, these are projections from the OECD FAO exercise that is done yearly. For the next 10 years or the next 15 years or so, what you can see there will be a growth in supply and demand, but most importantly, a growth in net trade. The difference between the two graphs is straight. And it's interesting to see what will be the difference in the different regions in the world. Now, in the industrial countries, as you can see with a solid line, the net trade position will more or less stay the same. But within industrial countries, the change will be significant in the European Union, which is projected to become a much bigger net deficit area compared to what it was in the past. And this is basically with current policies. This is not taking into account many future policies that may be instituted. On the other hand, the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, are expected to become a growing net exporter in the world. These are the two sort of big blocks. However, when it comes to the developing countries, this is the least developed country group. You can see a big net deficit in the next 20 years, which is growing. In the other developing countries, also you can see a growing net deficit. And that is consistent with the picture of expanding trade that I mentioned earlier. Now, talking about policies, we heard this morning that in the EU, at least, the policies are becoming less distorting. But in fact, the rate of distortion hasn't decreased that much in the OECD. This is the OECD analysis, which shows the top line gives you the nominal total rate of support in billions, okay? The one is just normalization. The black line below it gives you the rate of distortion, and the blue line is the rate of producer support estimate. And as you can see, in nominal terms, not in real terms, the support has continued quite strongly. The rate of distortion, classified by a way that makes distortion sort of, when it's market-based, is more distortive than when it's not. You can see it has slowed down, but not too much. There's still a lot of distortion around in the world in terms of agricultural policies, and that is something that looks likely to continue for the years to come. In terms of what is causing the distortions, the import barriers seem to be by far the dominant distortion part, because as you can see here, the bulk of all the distortion is from import barriers. And talking about then climate change, the aggregate impacts are relatively small until the mid-century. This is something that most people, perhaps, this is a scientific assessment, but they vary a lot by region. So land suitability will go down in Africa and Latin America, but initially up in the north. And the yields will go up in the north, as the climate change scientists say. For instance, by 2050, the maize prices are expected to be up way about 200% more than what they're expected under no climate change. And there will be smaller and slower reductions in hunger. This is one of the impacts of climate change. the one thing also that is likely to change is that the uncertainty and variability. We heard yesterday that yields are becoming more variable. That's not really supported by evidence. If you look at yields of various products around the world, actually aggregate, the variability has been going down. But there is a lot of short-term and very specific instability in yields. Nevertheless, the responses to that are the same. You have to improve the general capacity to adapt, technology, market, and risk management, and this is the new frontier to deal with the climate change. Now, this is the result of the only pretty much study that has tried to look at what is the impact on agricultural production due to climate change. This is Klein's study of 2007 without carbon, and you can see with the different colors where the impact is going to be. And there are several regions, especially in the north, where gains are expected from climate change, but there will be a lot of losses in the south. This already raises an alarm in terms of the population issue was discussed this morning, because if population movements become accentuated and much bigger because of the climate change, it's going to be from the south to the north. This immigration issue is going to become a much bigger issue because of the climate change and induced by that. So this is an effect on maize yields, for instance. And the global rainfed maize yields declined by 17%, but as you can see, there is a difference in the different lists. Now, what are the developments in global food and agricultural sectors that will condition the future trade patterns and policies? Well, we have uneven growth, and this is something that perhaps needs to change. There needs to be a growth in investments. Investment in agriculture, both private and public, has gone down. There is still tremendous need to increase investments, especially in developing countries. The reform towards decoupled support is something that has started and needs to continue and will continue. There is a lot of policy reform in developing countries. Earlier it was mentioned that the developing countries are taxing their agriculture. It is correct. But if you look at historical patterns, even the developed countries now, they started from a policy of taxing agriculture and then eventually supporting it before going down to trying to liberalize. The developing countries currently are in the middle phase. They're going from a net taxation to a net support. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, the net support is growing in almost all developing countries. So the interesting political question is, will they be able to go through this transition, which is a kind of a political economy-induced transition, or will they be clipped through going through that, and what will be the adjustment phases of that? On volatility, we heard something about that. If you look at past trends, volatility has not increased, but in the future, it appears that price volatility may increase because of the additional factors like petroleum, exchange rate volatility, and some of the other impacts. And so there is a lot of concern about supplies and food security. There's concerns about environmental impacts. There is growing concentration and value chains in the food system. That's another concern. What the impacts of that are has not been really analyzed yet. There is a lot of consumer-driven food attributes and safety issues, proliferation of regional and bilateral agreements, and finally, there's growing water scarcity and increased food emergencies due to climate change. That is already evident. In the last 20 years, food emergencies have expanded quite a lot, and water scarcity is becoming increasingly a problem. So what's my final message? The first one is that generally, we are optimistic on the global supply prospects, but we need investments to increase productivity growth. And the productivity growth will come from, actually, somebody mentioned earlier about new technologies. Actually, with existing technologies on the shelf, you can increase production tremendously in developing countries. Even without inventing new technologies, there is enough on-the-shelf technologies to increase production tremendously. But also now the investments will need to be to increase the production of environmental services. But you need to increase access to food, and that means income and opportunities for income. So it's not just supply. The supply is only one part of the equation, but demand is another part of the equation. And we need, in order to deal with volatility, we need institutions to manage the world market volatility and the unreliability. The current institutions have proven not to be adequate. There need to be new institutions, and there needs to be quite a bit more thought in that. And of course, we need to improve the ability to adapt and respond to new pressures and uncertainty, and not just on average. And finally, we need to increase incomes, not just in agriculture, but in other sectors. And the biofuels is likely to exacerbate the hunger situation, and that needs to be kept into consideration. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Saris, for keeping your time relatively closely. Ambassador, can you give us the perspective from an African country which is supposed to be suffering a lot from climate change, as we just heard? I understand that that Malawi is one of the good examples in Africa. Can you share that experience?
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, Malawi is a good example. But before I give you that example, I want to emphasize one word that is going to bridge what Bagwati, Efisha, and Harris have just said now, and what was said in the morning. And that word is partnership. In order for Europe and Africa, or the world, if I say, in the larger extent, to produce enough food and ensure food security, Europe and Africa, or to a larger extent, the developing world, need to enter into a partnership, a stronger partnership than the traditional one. This partnership will be based on a basis that is asymmetry. What is this? This is actually the economic divide. On one side, you have Europe that is developed. Agriculture transformation is advanced. The rural areas are limited. You have a very small population in the rural areas compared to Africa, for example, where 80% of people live in the rural area and depend on agriculture. There is asymmetry and there is economic divide in terms of the support of this very important sector, agriculture. In Europe, if you look at the distributional structure of the green box subsidy, a study by International Center for Trade Sustainable Development has indicated that the system absorbs 50% of European budget and benefits 2% of European population. And the system concentrates 80% of support on 20% of farmers. But on the other side in Africa, where we have over 75% population dependent in agriculture and living in the rural area, you get less than 10% of budgeted allocation in agriculture, a big divide. Let's look at trade. Agriculture is so key to LDCs, in particular in Africa. But the continent has not benefited from international trade. Africa's world agriculture trade has declined from 15% in 1960 down to 5.4% in 1980. And now, in 2006, 3.2%. And the fingers are pointing to the unfair international trade. But we have commonalities, and that's what I want to focus, this partnership. For Africa, with Europe, we have the partnership, the economic partnership through the Cotonou Partnership Agreement, which has emphasized for a long time on economic development, trade cooperation, and political dialogue. But at the same time, in terms of emerging issue, we share a common challenge, that's climate change. All of us are suffering the consequences, even though for our countries it's much more than in Europe. The financial crisis, America and Europe sneezed, Africa is coughing. But if you leave Africa cough, America and Europe are going to get a flu. So we need to work together as partners to be able to address these issues. And what are the solutions? And that's what I want to emphasize on Malawi's example. I have highlighted 3. But first, and the most important, it is the importance of political leadership with vision in Africa, focusing on policy frameworks that will define agriculture policies and strategies that will actually have impact. The President of the Republic of Malawi, Bingu Mutharika, said in one of the forums that enough is enough. I am not going on my knees to beg for food. Let us grow the food ourselves. That was when Malawi had suffered 4 years in chronic food shortages, and people died. Malawi put in place home-based strategy focused on agriculture and food security. Within the year of that policy, Malawi turned into a surplus producer of the food maize and exported in 2007. So it is not just word. The political will and leadership translated into action produced result. Malawi, for the next 4 years in a row, has actually been a surplus producer of maize, which is the food staple. So their action can be real. The president, actually, has also further mentioned, as the current president for the African Union, in his actually acceptance speech, he indicated that he would request the AU, the African Union Assembly, to share his dream that in 5 years from now, no child in Africa should die of hunger and malnutrition, and no child should go to bed hungry. This is said on the backdrop that Africa is endowed with vast fertile soils, favorable climate, vast water basins, perennial rivers, and that they could be utilized for irrigation and farming and lead to a green revolution. So yes, Africa has the potential. And with good policies, there could be a set underlying background to be able to produce enough food and even feed the world. Africa is a food basket. Secondly, how can this be done? And I again want to emphasize partnership, that we need to partner together and focus investing more in agriculture as partners. Not only and not mostly emphasizing on food aid. There are 2 reasons to that. First, importance investing in agriculture, studies have shown that, and this has been from cross-country analysis, that the sources of growth matter. And growth originating from agriculture is on average 2 times effective in benefiting the poorest of the country compared to growth in non-agriculture. Now, when we invest in agriculture, we are solving the food divide, the poverty divide. But at the same time, we're going to be nourishing the globe. How do we invest in technologies? Sharing technologies has been said, sharing issues of continuous research and development, including adaptational measures for climate change. Africa needs modern seeds, organic and inorganic fertilizers, irrigation technology. Africa, in terms of utilization of fertilizer, actually consumes only 8 kilograms per capita, compared to 90 on average with other countries. So there is a room for utilization. And how do we also invest and partner in agriculture? Infrastructure, including energy. But we should not forget one thing when we are actually partnering together to feed the world. The role of the private sector and the civil society. They are very key. Thirdly, one of the ways we can actually partner is on market access. It was presented in the morning, issue of international trade. The Doha round, they have not been concluded. Who are the victims and who are losers in this negotiation that is not concluded? It is Africa. In this case, the third element on where we can partner is to ensure that the international trade arrangements should not be harmful to developing countries, and mostly to conclude on the Doha round. This is the way we can partner. Malawi has defined a framework which, to some extent, is the beginning of the Green Revolution in Malawi, and to some extent in Africa, because other countries actually have picked up on this. There has been criticism that there has been overemphasis on input subsidies, because that is how Malawi has done it, by focusing on the most vulnerable 1.7 million farmers that are food deficit. That is where the country, the government has subsidized seed and fertilizers. But Malawi actually has defined a roadmap. The subsidy is like a road going to Paris from Brussels. But to actually attend a forum and have discussion for an agreement in Paris. So the country has defined a growth development strategy with priority areas, 9 priority areas. In the long run, well, in the medium to long term, there are priorities that actually would build on this short-term program that has been successful in Malawi using irrigation. We have an initiative called, I'm trying to simplify it, but it's mostly in irrigation. The initiative I should have to write. It is the Green Belt, Green Belt Irrigation and Water Management, which is going to harness 1 million hectares of perennial rivers and waters in irrigating crops that are strategic, food crops and cash crops, but also looking at the whole value chain of production, processing, and value addition with all the input delivery system and the infrastructure within the areas. So that is one way of actually coming up with a medium to long-term measure that is building on this success story. There are other measures. Climate change and national resource management is one of the priorities that the country is addressing, with the national adaptation strategy that is put in place. At the same time, the country is also focusing on developing social sectors. I'm not going to mention...
Maybe we don't. We'll have to maybe cut you short a little bit here, because we're getting closer to the end of the session. Yes. We want to hear about the Russian experience, and then we can open the floor to more questions, and we can hear maybe more about the measures that Malawi has taken. Yes. Mr. Rilko, please, can you give us the perspective from Russia?
Yes, I'm very happy to participate in this really global event where you can have opportunity to listen to speakers from Malawi and Russia, the same table, and it gives you really global perspective what happens in this fascinating world of agribusiness. I will show you a couple of slides. I will skip some slides because we are really running out of time. Just to remind those who probably don't remember or don't know where Russia is right now on the global perspective. We occupy about 2% of world agricultural trade, but at the same time we are uniquely positioned to be world's biggest exporter of mineral fertilizers. We are number 3 for exporter of wheat, number 2 exporter of barley, number 3 exporter of sun oil, and we occupy a number 1 position in world import of meat, butter, apples, and many other commodities. So it's really a unique positioning on the globe. This is a really striking slide. Let me quickly explain what it means. The rest of the world during last almost 20 years has gained additional agricultural land, and the amount of this additional agricultural land was about 32 million hectares. It was mostly due to efforts of our Brazilian, Argentinian colleagues and so on. At the same time, 3 former Soviet Union nations have lost 27 million hectares of arable agricultural land, mostly highly fertile black soil land. Russia alone has lost more than about 11 million of such a land. So altogether, world have added just 7 million just because of this big loss of agricultural land in our countries. At the same time, dramatic repositioning of our role on the world agricultural system has taken place. As you may see, our 3 countries have shifted from being #1 grain importing nation to big grain exporting region. Russia alone exported last year more grain than Soviet Union imported in the end of ages. So why this dramatic shift has taken place? Just to give you a couple of explanations. Weather and climatic conditions. Unlike other people, the weather opinions, the weather is very good for our region up until today. Knock on wood. Macroeconomics. As you know, we enjoyed very high prices for oil and gas, and it allowed to put big investments into all sectors of national economy. Growing state support of agriculture and agribusiness. Russia converted its opinion, Russian politicians converted its opinion about our agriculture from traditional vision on agriculture as type of black box. You invest a lot of money and they disappear somewhere in endless fields. So nowadays, they really understand the value in agriculture, and our agribusiness policies become type of more rational. And finally, emergence of so-called new agricultural operators. This is a unique feature of Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. Big guys invest big money, and these big guys are rooted into mostly not in agriculture, but in other. Their money come from other industries. 100,000 hectares is not a rare case of under-operation, is not the rare case in our country. Let me show this to cut and paste. Very important slide. What we're doing with our grain. Our key specialization is feeding mostly developing countries of Middle East, North Africa, and many other countries. Last year, we exported our wheat to 70 countries in the world, all over the world, with cheapest 11.5, 12.5 protein milling wheat. It is cheapest, and as you can see, our share on this specific market is pretty high. Last year it was more than 1/3, and this year it could be even higher. So some key final slide, just to share with you our problems, our challenges. We may position these problems into, as our friends Americans teach us, we may position each of these problems into opportunity. First, I would mention growing some challenge and strategic bifurcation between 2 government policies and 2 government orientation in my country. First is growing self-sufficiency. This is one national priority, fixed in so-called food doctrine, adopted by Russian president several months ago. And second is growing specialization and exploiting our competitive advantages, such as food wheat exportation to the rest of the world. In many cases, these two priorities contradict each other, as you can imagine. Second is development of infrastructure, which becomes highest priority for domestic agriculture. When we were just struggling for self-sufficiency, this was one case. But when we have huge export surpluses, we understand that our huge distances in Russia and state of infrastructure are becoming real impediments to further development. And just to mention agricultural science and education. We need new technologies and new people and new professors and new scientists to address many technical issues of our agriculture. We have many agricultural universities, many professors, many scientists, but mostly they represent old guard and don't serve properly what we really need to improve in our country. Thank you.
Thank you all for making these enlightening statements. We're getting slightly into overtime already, so I will take a number of questions from the floor. There will be a short vote right after that, so be ready with your small machines. Can you please show your hands, those who want to ask questions? Okay, if there aren't any, I see one there, yes. And a second one. Can somebody please try and get a microphone to the right here?
Yes. Is it on? Yeah. I would...
Go on, sir.
Me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So Esa Härmälä, Fertilizers Europe. My question is to Mr. Rilko of Russia. So we are aware of these agro holdings, which are really huge. Also collective farms and state farms were huge. In most of the world there is some experience that a farmer or a person responsible of farming must be able to keep more or less each hectare on eye every moment, every day. Because weather is different, rainfall is different, there might be disease and so. Are you completely confident so that the economics of scale in that order of magnitude, what now is implemented in Russia, Ukraine and Kazakhstan, will be a success story? Is there a risk of being too big? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take right away another question and try and bundle them. I see there's a gentleman, two gentlemen there at the back. Yes.
To Dr. Nizale, from previous speakers and what we often read in the literature, we see that the future, and both because of global climate change and population increase, LDCs, so-called LDCs, they will suffer the most and become more net importers of food than many of them already are. From your presentation, you paint quite a different picture. So I would like to hear from you if the Malawian success story can really be extrapolated to other LDCs in Africa. And I would also like a comment from that from Mr. Saris, please.
Okay, I'll take one last one, and then we'll go for the round of answers.
Bradley, is this working? There we go. Paul Bradley from the UK. It's another question to Dimitri. You talked about some of the tensions between your first two priorities, the growing self-sufficiency and the growing specialisation. I suppose as we look forward to the challenges out to 2050 of climate change and things like that, I was hoping you might reflect a bit more on these tensions and where you see things moving in the future.
Okay, maybe we can start with those actually can be bundled with the first one, which was about the risk of overproduction in Russia.
I will try to be as quick as possible because we run out of time. First question about agri-holdings. Of course, we can talk about it for hours. I am not sure at all that this is the best and optimal way to carry out farming in the world in general and in our three countries specifically. But it seems to me that we don't have a different option and different alternative right now. My personal relation to this phenomenon is as follows. It seems to me that this is a way of reloading and type of speedy reindustrialization of domestic agriculture in three countries. And it is not by chance. It is not only for Russia. It is for Ukraine and to an even larger extent to Kazakhstan, which means that it is not by chance and there is something fundamental behind it. So it seems to me that in 10 years, in 5 to 10 years, these big entities will be converted into something more close to classical family farming, where we will have a much better control over the fields, daily control over the fields, so that we will drift towards what is called perpetual stewardship rather than big entrepreneurial corporate type of vertically integrated bureaucracies right now. As to climate change and global perspective, I would bet that in 10 years, Russia will definitely be #1 wheat exporter in the world. So we can, if we survive in 10 years, we could meet with you and see each other. So it's type of public pari. Ceteris paribus. I'm not sure. I'm not a specialist in global warming and global dimming. So it's. As of today, we observe rather beneficial climatic changes to most of key agricultural areas in my country.
Okay, turning to Malawi, is the experience of your country replicable in Africa, and why does it seem like you don't feel the effects of climate change at the moment? What measures?
No, we do feel the climate change, actually, the impacts are visible. And I think Malawi, like Africa, actually experiencing that because we have frequent droughts and floods. In 1 year, you can experience drought in one part of the country and floods in the other part of the country. A number of lakes in Africa, especially Lake Chad, is shrinking. I think that shrunk by 1/3. The Kilimanjaro mountain glacier is melting. So the impacts are there. We can feel them. Why Malawi actually has succeeded in the past 4 years is, of course, we can say that the weather was good. It rained throughout. And so we did not have the vagaries of floods and droughts. But at national level, we were able to hold and get enough food and then kept the strategic reserves where the hunger spots were taken care of. In addition, that is why we are now emphasizing on irrigation, small-scale irrigation. And that is where the technology is required, because Africa, in particular Malawi, has vast amounts of perennial rivers and some lakes that could be used for even agriculture as a solution to climate change. So we believe that in working on this program and medium-term measures would be able to address both the food issue and the climate change issue. But we cannot do it alone. We have to partner with the developed world because you are a big player into the issue of climate change, in addition to solutions in terms of technology and adaptation measures.
Okay, thank you. Maybe a closing statement now, and then we can go on to the voting.
Yes, the question I want to address myself to is whether the Malawi experience is replicable to other developing countries. Well, the Malawi experience has been a success, and why has it been a success? Because it has raised production with the stimulus that was needed. In Africa, the problem, as many of us know, is a supply side problem. And the supply side problem is lack of inputs, lack of infrastructure, and lack of markets. Now, so the subsidies in that context, because the program was based on subsidies, have to be looked at in that context, namely stimulating or overcoming some of these supply constraints. It appears that in the Malawi case, they have worked. And this is a case that's very different from the subsidies that are given in the developed countries, which are given in the context of fairly developed markets and infrastructure. So my point is that in situations, in countries, developing or least developed countries, where these markets don't work, in other words, where there's a lot of market constraints, a lot of infrastructure constraints, and a lot of supply side problems, this type of initial stimulus and can help kickstart the system and can help a growth process. The trick is not to become, continue these subsidies, to have some kind of an exit strategy at some point, because that's very, as we all know in Europe, it's a very difficult thing to do once you get started on subsidies. So the point is, yes, it can be done not in all developed or least developed countries, but also in the countries where there is potential. The market constraints and other supply side constraints are very strong and only for a limited period of time.
Thank you very much. We'll close it here. We'll move on to this electronic voting. There's a couple of questions that will appear, should appear in a few minutes on the screen. If these questions can now be displayed. Can you give me the... try and get this thing to work.
That was good.
Sorry?
That was a good, yeah, a good presentation. Eh? You had a
Okay.
good presentation.
Well, I'll discover the questions with you. So with current trends, can one feed the world in a sustainable fashion? One, with combating climate change. 2, birth control. Reform of the WTO is the 3rd. 4, innovation, such as biotechnology. Or 5, I don't know.
People will vote for number
Please
3 and
push
4.
now. I don't know whether the results are supposed to be appearing straight away. I think we'll move to the next one straight. No, it's the only one. Okay, we see the results here. Innovation comes out as a big winner. As you can see, so that's food for thought, I guess, for the rest of the session today. Some might disagree, I guess, but
someone did vote for birth control.
there's a few for birth control, interestingly, yes. Okay, another series of questions. How can one best ensure the fight against world hunger? Is it 1, more food production and better distribution? Is it economic growth? 2nd, more investment in development cooperation, microcredits. 3, rural development. 4, 5, I don't know. Vote now and
To see if someone
I
put
think
that, I don't know.
it should appear in seconds. There you go. A more even distribution of answers, as you can see. Supply side again, and more investment in development cooperation. thank you very much for your time in this session. I think we have to close it because the next one is starting very soon, and there's one more question. Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll leave you to read it for yourself. I guess the voting has now closed. There you go. Again, a very mixed picture. Good. Thank you all very much. We're moving to the next panel session. And thank you for coming.